In the serene town of Westbridge, where Southern charm hides simmering tensions, Mayor Elijah Bennett has become a symbol of progress and hope. But when a routine drive home turns into a nightmare, Elijah finds himself unjustly detained by Officer Samuel Grayson, a man whose rigid sense of duty is tainted by deep-seated prejudice. What follows is not just a fight for personal justice, but a battle to expose the systemic racism lurking beneath the town's surface. As the town erupts in outrage and division, Elijah must confront the ghosts of his past, including the dark legacy of his father's brutal encounter with the very police force now holding him captive. The deeper he and Detective Karen Whitaker dig, the more they uncover a truth that ties their lives together in ways neither could have imagined, revealing that Grayson's father was one of the officers responsible for the violence that shaped Elijah's life. Shadows of Truth is a gripping tale of justice, redemption, and the painful legacy of racism. As Elijah and Grayson are forced to face the truths about their fathers and themselves, they must decide whether to continue the cycle of prejudice and division, or to forge a new path toward reconciliation and hope for Westbridge. The road to healing is long and fraught with peril, but for the first time, the town stands at the brink of true change. Premise: in the quiet town of Westbridge, where the charm of Southern hospitality masks deep-seated tensions, a respected black man, Elijah Bennett, serves as the town's mayor. Elijah is a tall, dignified man in his mid-40s, known for his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. His leadership has brought a sense of hope and unity to a town that has long struggled with its racial history. After a particularly grueling day at City Hall, Elijah is driving home when he is abruptly pulled over by Officer Samuel Grayson, a young and ambitious police officer with a reputation for being strict and by the book. Grayson is a burly man in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a rigid demeanor, who believes in maintaining law and order at any cost. However, Grayson's perception of order is tainted by the prejudices he grew up with, and his views are often colored by a subconscious bias he refuses to acknowledge. As Elijah hands over his license and registration, the tension between them is palpable. Elijah remains calm, his voice steady, while Grayson's tone is cold and dismissive. The situation escalates when Grayson, under the pretext of following standard procedure, insists on searching Elijah's car. Despite Elijah's polite protests, he finds himself handcuffed and taken to the Westbridge Police Precinct, where the reality of the situation begins to unravel. In the precinct, Elijah is subjected to further indignities, with Officer Grayson justifying his actions as routine. However, when the booking officer, Detective Karen Whitaker, a seasoned and fair-minded woman in her early 50s, discovers Elijah's identity, she is horrified by the treatment he has received. Karen, who has spent her career trying to bridge the gap between the police and the community, is faced with a moral dilemma: defend her colleague or confront the ugly truth. As the news of Elijah's wrongful arrest spreads, the town erupts in outrage. Elijah, determined to use his experience to bring about meaningful change, spearheads a series of reforms aimed at addressing systemic bias within the police department. He works closely with Karen, who becomes his ally, to implement new training programs, establish a civilian oversight board, and restore trust between the police and the community. Emotional hook. Elijah's journey is not just about seeking justice for himself, but about confronting the ghosts of his past. Unbeknownst to most, Elijah's father, a civil rights activist, was brutally beaten by the Westbridge police in the 1960s, a trauma that shaped Elijah's dedication to justice. This personal connection adds layers of complexity to his mission, as he struggles with the fear of history repeating itself. Plot twist. As Elijah and Karen dig deeper into the town's history and the roots of its systemic racism, they uncover a shocking secret. Samuel Grayson's father was one of the officers involved in the assault on Elijah's father. This revelation forces both Elijah and Grayson to confront the legacies of their fathers and the painful truth that their lives have been intertwined by a history of violence and prejudice. In a climactic confrontation, Elijah must decide whether to pursue retribution or seek a path of reconciliation. while Grayson is faced with the realization that the very foundation of his beliefs is built on a lie. The novel's ending leaves the town of Westbridge at a crossroads, as its citizens must choose between repeating the mistakes of the past or forging a new future based on understanding and mutual respect. Shadows of Truth is a powerful exploration of the complexities of race, justice, and the impact of the past on the present. Through the intertwined fates of its characters, the novel delves into the difficult but necessary process of confronting uncomfortable truths and the possibility of redemption. In the quaint town of Westbridge, where Southern charm and deep-seated secrets coexist, Mayor Elijah Bennett is a beacon of hope and progress. A man of integrity and resilience, Elijah has dedicated his life to serving a community that has long grappled with its troubled past. But one fateful evening, as he drives home after a long day at City Hall, everything changes. Pulled over by Officer Samuel Grayson, a young, hard-edged cop with a rigid sense of duty, Elijah finds himself unjustly detained and humiliated. What should have been a routine drive home spirals into a harrowing encounter that exposes the deep cracks in Westbridge's veneer of civility. As Elijah is dragged into the very system he has worked to improve, the town erupts in outrage, and the true nature of its divisions is laid bare. Determined to turn his ordeal into a catalyst for change, Elijah joins forces with Detective Karen Whitaker, a seasoned officer torn between loyalty to her colleague and her own commitment to justice. Together, they launch a crusade to reform the police department, confronting the biases that have festered for generations. But as they dig deeper into Westbridge's history, they unearth a shocking secret that ties their fates together in ways neither could have imagined. Samuel Grayson's father was one of the officers who brutalized Elijah's father during the civil rights era, a legacy of violence that casts a long shadow over both their lives. Now, Elijah must grapple with the painful legacy of the past while forging a path toward a more just future. And as Grayson confronts the truth about his own family, he faces a choice: continue down the path of prejudice and division, or break the cycle and seek redemption. Shadows of Truth is a gripping and emotionally charged novel that explores the complexities of race, justice, and the long shadow of history. In a town at the crossroads of change, one man's fight for justice will challenge the very fabric of a community and uncover the hidden connections that bind us all. Physical description: tall, dignified man in his mid-40s with a lean, athletic build. He has deep brown skin, short-cropped hair speckled with gray, and warm, intelligent eyes that reflect both compassion and determination. His presence is commanding, yet his smile is disarming. Backstory: born and raised in Westbridge, Elijah is the son of a civil rights activist who was brutally beaten by local police in the 1960s. This traumatic event shaped his lifelong commitment to justice and equality. After studying law and working as a public defender, Elijah returned to his hometown to serve as mayor, driven by a desire to heal the wounds of the past and bring progress to Westbridge. Physical description: a burly man in his mid-30s with a square jaw, close-cropped blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes. He has a muscular build and a stern, almost intimidating demeanor. His uniform is always impeccably pressed, reflecting his strict adherence to rules and order. Backstory: Samuel grew up in a family with a strong law enforcement tradition, idolizing his father, who was a decorated officer. Unbeknownst to him, his father's past includes dark secrets that taint Samuel's sense of justice. Samuel joined the police force to honor his father's legacy, but his rigid views and subconscious biases often lead him to enforce the law without considering its impact on those he serves. Physical description: a tall woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back into a neat bun, sharp hazel eyes, and a slender frame. She has a composed, professional demeanor, with a face that reveals the wear of years spent in law enforcement. Backstory: Karen is a veteran detective who has seen the best and worst of Westbridge. She has spent her career trying to balance her commitment to the law with her deep sense of fairness. She grew up in a neighboring town and moved to Westbridge after marrying her late husband, who was a well-respected local teacher. Karen has always believed in bridging the gap between the police and the community, and Elijah's case forces her to confront the realities of the system she's been a part of for decades. Physical description: a tall, slender man in his late 50s with dark skin, short curly hair, and kind, wise eyes. He carries himself with a quiet dignity and often dresses in simple, yet well-worn suits. Backstory: Reverend Johnson is the spiritual leader of Westbridge's largest church and a pillar of the community. He has been a mentor to Elijah since he was a child and was close friends with Elijah's father. Known for his calm demeanor and ability to bring people together, Reverend Johnson plays a key role in supporting Elijah's fight for justice and guiding the town through its crisis. Description: a stately red brick building located in the heart of Westbridge, featuring large arched windows and a grand entrance. The interior is a mix of old Southern charm with modern updates: polished wooden floors, high ceilings with ornate molding, and walls adorned with portraits of past mayors. The town hall is where Elijah spends much of his time, symbolizing the seat of local power and the ongoing struggle for progress and justice. Description: a stark, utilitarian building with a gray, concrete facade. The interior is functional and somewhat dated, with fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, and a mix of old and new technology. The precinct is a place of both order and tension, representing the town's complex relationship with law enforcement. Description: a modest two-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street. The home has a warm, inviting feel, with a front porch that Elijah often sits on to unwind after a long day. Inside, the decor is simple but tasteful, with family photos, bookshelves filled with law books and history texts, and a well-used kitchen. It's a sanctuary for Elijah, a place where he reflects on his past and plans for the future. Description: an old but well-maintained church with white clapboard siding and a tall steeple that towers over the surrounding neighborhood. The interior is warm and inviting, with wooden pews, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible, and a large pulpit where Reverend Johnson delivers his sermons. The church serves as a spiritual and community hub, offering a place of solace and unity in times of trouble. Description: the historic heart of the town, lined with a mix of small businesses, cafes, and older brick buildings. The street is always bustling with activity, from locals running errands to tourists admiring the town's quaint charm. Main Street is a symbol of Westbridge's public face, a place where the community comes together, but also where its underlying tensions occasionally surface. Setting: Westbridge Town Hall, late afternoon. Summary: Mayor Elijah Bennett ends a demanding day at City Hall, eager to return home. As he walks through the halls, the weight of his responsibilities is palpable, hinting at the challenges that lie ahead. Setting: a quiet, tree-lined street in Westbridge, early evening. Summary: on his way home, Elijah is pulled over by Officer Samuel Grayson. Confused and uneasy, Elijah complies, unaware of the ordeal about to unfold. Setting: the side of the road, under the fading light. Summary: Grayson, suspicious and hostile, questions Elijah aggressively. Despite Elijah's calm demeanor, Grayson escalates the situation, leading to a search of the car and Elijah's eventual arrest. Setting: Westbridge Police Precinct, early evening. Summary: Elijah is brought to the precinct, where Detective Karen Whitaker realizes his identity. Shocked, she questions Grayson's actions, but is met with defiance. The injustice of the situation begins to weigh heavily on her. Setting: outside the Westbridge Police Precinct, late night. Summary: Elijah is released with a citation, but the experience leaves him shaken and angry. As he drives home, he resolves to seek justice, setting the stage for the events to come. Setting: Elijah's home and various locations around Westbridge, early morning. Summary: news of Elijah's arrest spreads rapidly through Westbridge, igniting outrage among the town's black community and sparking debate among its residents. Elijah's phone is flooded with calls of support, but also with demands for action. Setting: a local cafe in Westbridge, midday. Summary: Elijah meets with Karen, who expresses her concerns about Grayson's actions. Karen, torn between her duty and her conscience, offers to help Elijah navigate the legal and political challenges ahead. Setting: Westbridge Town Hall, evening. Summary: a tense town hall meeting is held, where Elijah publicly addresses the incident. The meeting is charged with emotion as residents express their fears, anger, and hopes. Elijah vows to fight for justice, but he is met with resistance from those who support Grayson and the status quo. Setting: Elijah's home, late evening. Summary: exhausted from the day's events, Elijah reflects on the personal toll the incident is taking. He confides in his wife, who worries about the impact this fight will have on their family and Elijah's health. Setting: Elijah's home office, late night. Summary: Elijah decides to launch a formal investigation into the police department, knowing it will be a difficult and dangerous path. He reaches out to allies in the community, including Reverend Johnson, to gather support for the fight ahead. Setting: Westbridge Police Precinct, early morning. Summary: Karen grapples with her role in the investigation. She confronts Grayson, who remains unrepentant, and begins to distance herself from her colleagues who defend his actions. Setting: various locations around Westbridge, midday. Summary: Elijah and his team start their investigation, interviewing residents and uncovering past instances of police misconduct. They discover that Grayson's behavior is part of a larger pattern of racial bias within the department. Setting: Elijah's childhood home, afternoon. Summary: Elijah visits his mother, who shares painful memories of his father's beating by the police. This deepens Elijah's resolve to see the investigation through, despite the personal cost. Setting: Westbridge Town Hall, evening. Summary: as the investigation gains traction, Elijah faces increasing pushback from the police union and local politicians who fear the consequences of exposing the truth. Threats and intimidation tactics begin to surface, heightening the stakes. Setting: St. John's Church, late evening. Summary: Reverend Johnson organizes a community gathering to show support for Elijah. The overwhelming turnout and unity among the residents give Elijah renewed strength to continue his fight. Setting: Westbridge Library, morning. Summary: Elijah and Karen uncover old records that reveal Samuel Grayson's father was one of the officers involved in the brutal beating of Elijah's father. This revelation connects the past to the present, deepening the emotional complexity of the story. Setting: Westbridge Police Precinct, midday. Summary: armed with the new information, Elijah confronts Grayson about his father's involvement. Grayson is initially defensive, but the confrontation plants seeds of doubt and guilt in his mind. Setting: Elijah's office, afternoon. Summary: Elijah's team faces setbacks as key witnesses refuse to testify, fearing retaliation. Frustrated but undeterred, Elijah strategizes with Karen and Reverend Johnson on how to keep the investigation alive. Setting: Grayson's home, evening. Summary: Grayson begins to wrestle with the truth about his father and his own actions. His internal conflict intensifies as he realizes the legacy of violence and prejudice he has inherited. Setting: Westbridge Police Precinct, late evening. Summary: Karen gathers crucial evidence from a reluctant officer who decides to speak out. This evidence could be the key to exposing the systemic issues within the department, but it also puts Karen at risk of retaliation. Setting: Westbridge Town Hall, morning. Summary: the town is increasingly divided over the investigation. Protests break out, both in support of and against Elijah's efforts. The tension in Westbridge reaches a boiling point. Setting: Grayson's home, midday. Summary: Grayson, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, begins to unravel. He questions everything he has believed about his father and himself, and considers stepping forward with the truth. Setting: Westbridge Police Precinct, afternoon. Summary: just as the investigation seems to be gaining momentum, key evidence mysteriously disappears, and Karen faces disciplinary action. It becomes clear that someone within the department is trying to sabotage their efforts. Setting: Elijah's home, evening. Summary: Elijah is at his lowest point, questioning whether he can continue the fight. His family's concern for his safety and well-being weighs heavily on him, leading to a moment of doubt and despair. Setting: St. John's Church, late night. Summary: Reverend Johnson and the community rally around Elijah, reaffirming their support. Inspired by their faith in him, Elijah finds the strength to press on, vowing to see the investigation through to the end, no matter the cost. Setting: Grayson's home, early morning. Summary: Grayson, unable to live with the weight of his actions and his father's legacy, decides to come forward with the truth. He contacts Karen, agreeing to testify and provide the missing evidence. Setting: Westbridge Town Hall, midday. Summary: A public hearing is held where Grayson confesses to his misconduct and reveals the truth about his father's involvement in Elijah's father's beating. The revelation shocks the town, leading to widespread calls for accountability. Setting: Various locations around Westbridge, afternoon. Summary: The fallout from Grayson's confession is swift. The police chief resigns and several officers are placed under investigation. The community is shaken, but there is a renewed sense of hope as real change begins to take root. Setting: Elijah's home, evening. Summary: Elijah meets with Grayson privately. Though the conversation is tense, there is a mutual understanding that both men are victims of their father's legacies. They part ways with a tentative sense of reconciliation, each committed to moving forward in a better direction. Setting: St. John's Church, late evening. Summary: The community gathers at St. John's Church for a service led by Reverend Johnson. Elijah speaks to the congregation, reflecting on the journey they have all been through. The story ends with a sense of closure and the promise of a brighter future for Westbridge, as Elijah looks out at the faces of a town ready to heal and move forward together. This structure provides a clear progression of events, with each scene building on the previous one, to create a cohesive and compelling narrative that drives the story forward to its conclusion. Each chapter escalates the tension, deepens the emotional stakes, and leads naturally into the next, culminating in a powerful and satisfying ending. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the red brick facade of Westbridge Town Hall. Inside, Mayor Elijah Bennett was wrapping up his final meeting of the day. The conference room was nearly empty, save for a few lingering staff members collecting their notes and heading out. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The day had been long, filled with back-to-back meetings that demanded every ounce of his attention. "Mr. Mayor," Carla, his assistant, called softly as she approached. "I've prepared the notes for tomorrow's meetings, and there's a summary of today's discussions on your desk." Elijah smiled, though fatigue was evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Carla. I'll go over them tonight. Try to get some rest, too," Carla added, concern lacing her words. "You've been pushing yourself hard lately." "I will," Elijah replied, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. "I just need to unwind a bit." Carla nodded and left the room, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts. He walked over to the large windows that overlooked the town square, the evening light casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Westbridge was his home, a place he loved deeply, but it was also a town burdened with a history of racial tension that still simmered beneath the surface. Elijah had dedicated his life to bridging those divides, but days like this made him acutely aware of how far they still had to go. Grayson didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Elijah felt the knot of dread in his stomach tighten. After what felt like an eternity, Grayson looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to issue you a citation." "A citation for what?" Elijah asked, incredulity evident in his voice. "I haven't broken any laws." "Your record check came back with some discrepancies," Grayson said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Just a precaution." Elijah tried to remain calm, but his frustration was palpable. "Discrepancies? I've given you all the correct information. I don't understand why this is happening." Grayson ignored Elijah's protest and began filling out the citation, his movements deliberate and slow. The process seemed to drag on, each minute stretching longer than the last. Elijah felt a mix of anger and helplessness as he watched Grayson work, his deliberate slowness only adding to the insult. Finally, Grayson handed Elijah the citation, his demeanor still stern. "You need to sign this." Elijah glanced at the paper, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. "I don't agree with this, but fine, I'll sign it." As Elijah signed the citation, Grayson's expression remained unyielding. "You'll receive a court date in the mail. Until then, you're free to go." Elijah took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Thank you. I hope this issue can be resolved quickly." Grayson didn't respond, turning on his heel and heading back to his cruiser. Elijah watched him go, feeling a heavy weight of injustice settle over him. He climbed back into his car, the evening's chill sinking into his bones. As he drove away, Elijah glanced at the citation in his hands, a mixture of anger and resignation bubbling within him. The peaceful evening he had anticipated was replaced by an unsettling encounter that left him questioning the fairness of the system he had always trusted. The drive home was a blur of emotions. The once quiet streets of Westbridge now seemed oppressive, the shadows cast by the streetlights feeling longer and darker. Elijah's mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over, searching for a reason, any reason, that could explain why he had been treated the way he had. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the familiar comfort of home did little to ease the tension knotting in his chest. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the citation on the passenger seat, the implications of the night's events weighing heavily on him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about something deeper, something that had simmered beneath the surface of Westbridge for far too long. Elijah knew that he couldn't just let this go. He had to do something, anything, to ensure that what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. As he stepped out of the car and headed inside, a steely resolve began to form. Tonight had shaken him, but it had also awakened something within him, a determination to seek justice, not just for himself, but for the entire community of Westbridge. He wouldn't let this stand. Not this time. Elijah closed the door behind him, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. But as he looked around his home, a place of warmth and love, he felt a flicker of hope. Tomorrow, he would begin to take the steps necessary to right this wrong. Tonight, he would rest. Tomorrow, the fight would begin. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Elijah Bennett's home, but the warmth it brought did little to dispel the chill that had settled over him. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, though he hadn't taken a sip. His mind was still reeling from the events of the previous night, the memory of Officer Grayson's cold, accusatory gaze playing on a loop in his head. The phone on the table buzzed incessantly, messages and calls pouring in. Elijah knew why. News of his arrest had spread through Westbridge like wildfire. He picked up the phone, scrolling through the messages. There were notes of support from friends and allies, but there were also questions, demands for action, and even a few thinly veiled threats from those who thought he was stirring up trouble. His wife, Grace, entered the kitchen, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Elijah, you need to eat something," she urged, placing a plate of toast in front of him. Elijah shook his head. "I can't think about food right now, Grace. The whole town knows what happened. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what kind of place Westbridge really is." Grace sat down beside him, reaching out to hold his hand. "I know, and that's exactly why you need to stay strong. People are looking to you, Elijah. You've always been the one to stand up for what's right." Elijah sighed, squeezing her hand in return. "I never wanted it to come to this, but now that it has, I can't ignore it. I won't." The phone buzzed again, and this time Elijah answered. It was Carla, his assistant. "Mayor Bennett," she said, her voice tense. "I've been getting calls all morning. The town is in an uproar. People are demanding answers. They want to know what you're going to do." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. "Set up a meeting with Detective Karen Whitaker. I need to speak with her directly." "Right away, sir," Carla replied. "And Elijah, be careful." "I will," Elijah said before hanging up. He turned to Grace, determination hardening his resolve. "I need to find out exactly what happened at that precinct last night. And I need to make sure something like this never happens again." Grace nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and pride. "Just promise me you'll be careful. We can't afford to lose you, Elijah. I promise, Elijah said, though he knew the road ahead would be anything but safe. The cafe was quiet, the usual hum of morning chatter subdued, as if the town itself sensed the tension brewing. Elijah sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, scanning the room for any sign of Detective Karen Whitaker. He didn't have to wait long. Karen walked in, her posture stiff, her expression serious. Elijah stood as she approached, extending his hand. Detective Whitaker, thank you for meeting with me. Karen shook his hand firmly, her hazel eyes searching his. Mr. Bennett, I wish we were meeting under different circumstances. Please call me Elijah, he said, motioning for her to sit. And I think we both know why we're here. They sat down, and for a moment, the only sound was the clink of silverware from the other patrons. Finally, Karen spoke. Elijah, I'm sorry for what happened to you last night. I had no idea who you were when you were brought in. If I had, it shouldn't have mattered who I was, Elijah interrupted gently. What happened was wrong, no matter who it happened to. But now that it's done, we need to figure out what to do next. Karen nodded, her face tight with conflict. You're right. I've been a cop for over 20 years, and I've seen the best and worst of this town. But last night crossed a line. Grayson had no business treating you or anyone the way he did. Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but intense. Then help me. Help me make sure that what Grayson did isn't something any officer in Westbridge ever does again. Karen hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if weighing her next words carefully. Elijah, you need to understand something. Grayson isn't just one bad apple. There's a culture in the department, one that's been festering for years. I've tried to fight it, to push for reforms, but it's like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. Then we need to change the system, Elijah replied, his tone resolute. I'm not just talking about making noise. I'm talking about real, lasting change. Karen's gaze met his, and for the first time, Elijah saw the flicker of hope in her eyes. You're serious about this? Dead serious, Elijah said. But I can't do it alone. I need someone on the inside, someone who knows the system and can help navigate it. Karen considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll help, but you need to be prepared for the backlash. This isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be pretty. I've never been one to back down from a fight, Elijah said with a small, grim smile. Karen returned the smile, albeit faintly. Then let's get to work. The evening sun cast long shadows across Westbridge as Elijah walked into the town hall. The building was packed, the air heavy with anticipation and tension. Word of the meeting had spread quickly, and the large conference room was filled to capacity with concerned citizens, local activists, and members of the press, all eager to hear what Elijah had to say. As he made his way to the front of the room, Elijah felt the weight of every eye on him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Carla was by his side, her presence a steadying force as she handed him a microphone. Elijah turned to face the crowd, scanning the sea of faces before him. He recognized many, friends, neighbors, colleagues, but there were also those who regarded him with suspicion, even hostility. The divide in the room was palpable. Thank you all for coming, Elijah began, his voice clear and firm. I know there's a lot of concern, a lot of anger, and rightfully so. What happened to me last night should never have happened to anyone. But this isn't just about me. It's about our community, our town, and the kind of place we want Westbridge to be. A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others crossing their arms defensively. Elijah continued, undeterred. I've spent my life working to make Westbridge a better place for all of us. But the events of last night have made it clear that we have a long way to go. We need to address the deep-seated issues that still plague our town. Issues of bias, of prejudice, of injustice. A voice from the back of the room interrupted. What are you saying, Mayor Bennett? That all our cops are racists? Elijah met the speaker's gaze, unflinching. I'm saying that we need to look at the systems in place and the culture they create. I'm saying that we need to make sure that every citizen of Westbridge, regardless of the color of their skin, can feel safe and respected by those who are sworn to protect them. A wave of applause erupted from one side of the room, while the other remained silent, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Elijah pressed on. I've already begun working with Detective Karen Whitaker to launch a full investigation into the incident and to look at the broader practices of our police department. This won't be a quick fix, and it won't be easy, but it's necessary, and I need your support to make it happen. The room was buzzing now, voices overlapping as people began to shout questions, comments, and accusations. Elijah held up his hand, signaling for calm. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. There will be more meetings, more discussions, and I want to hear from all of you. Together, we can make Westbridge a place where justice isn't just a word, but a reality for everyone. As the meeting continued, Elijah fielded questions, some supportive, others challenging. The tension was thick, but there was also a sense of momentum, of something shifting in the town's consciousness. By the time the meeting ended, Elijah was exhausted, but also resolute. The fight had begun, and there was no turning back. Later that evening, Elijah returned home, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. Grace was waiting for him in the living room, her worry evident in the furrow of her brow and the tightness of her smile. "How did it go?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "It was intense," Elijah admitted, sinking into the couch beside her. "People are angry, scared, but they're also ready for change. At least some of them are." Grace nodded, leaning into him. "I'm proud of you, Elijah, but I'm also worried. This is going to take a toll on you, on us." Elijah wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I know, but I can't walk away from this. It's too important. I just don't want to see you hurt," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose you to this fight." "You won't," Elijah assured her, though his own fears echoed hers. "We'll get through this together. We've been through worse, and we've come out stronger." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of their connection a balm against the uncertainty that lay ahead. But as the night wore on, Elijah's thoughts kept returning to the challenges that awaited him. He knew he was stepping into a storm, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. In the quiet of his home office, Elijah sat at his desk, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Papers were strewn across the surface. Notes from the meeting, documents related to the investigation, and a list of contacts he needed to reach out to. Elijah stared at the phone for a long moment before finally picking it up and dialing a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Reverend Johnson," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I need your help." The Reverend's voice was warm, reassuring. "Elijah, my son, you know I'm here for you. What do you need?" "I'm going to launch a formal investigation into the police department, but I can't do it alone. I need the community's support, and I need your guidance." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Elijah could almost picture Reverend Johnson nodding thoughtfully. "You're taking on a heavy burden, Elijah, but I've known you since you were a boy, and I know you're the right person for this. I'll do whatever I can to help." "Thank you, Reverend," Elijah said, relief washing over him. "We'll need to rally the community, get people on board. This is going to be a long, hard fight." "One step at a time," Reverend Johnson replied. "And remember, you don't have to carry this burden alone. We'll stand with you." As Elijah hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he wasn't walking it alone. He had allies, people who believed in him and in the cause. And together, they would fight for the soul of Westbridge. The decision had been made. The investigation would go forward, and Elijah would do whatever it took to see it through, no matter the cost. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of Detective Karen Whitaker's office at the Westbridge Police Precinct. The precinct was bustling with the usual activity, officers filing reports, the distant hum of phones ringing, and the occasional chatter between colleagues. But Karen's mind was elsewhere. She stared at the stack of paperwork on her desk, her thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. She had agreed to help Elijah Bennett, but now that the moment was upon her, the reality of what that meant began to sink in. Challenging the status quo within the department was not something to be taken lightly. It could mean alienating herself from colleagues she had known for years and potentially jeopardizing her career. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Karen looked up to see Officer Samuel Grayson standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Detective," Grayson greeted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Grayson," Karen replied, her tone neutral. Grayson took a seat across from her desk, leaning back casually. "I hear there's been some talk about what happened with Mayor Bennett." Karen's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Grayson to confront her so directly, but she maintained her composure. "There has been. People are concerned, and rightly so." Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. "People are always concerned when they don't understand the whole story. I did what needed to be done, Karen. You know how it is out there." Karen resisted the urge to sigh. She knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't back down. "Samuel, you went too far. Whatever you thought you were doing, it wasn't justified. Elijah Bennett is the mayor of this town, and more importantly, he's a citizen who deserves respect." Grayson's demeanor hardened. "I followed procedure. If he wasn't acting suspicious, none of this would have happened." Karen leaned forward, her voice firm but calm. "You and I both know that's not entirely true. You got to ask yourself, why did you feel the need to escalate things the way you did? Was it really about following procedure, or was there something else at play?" Grayson's jaw tightened, his face betraying a flicker of doubt. But he quickly pushed it aside, standing up abruptly. "You're starting to sound like one of them, Karen. Just be careful whose side you're on." With that, Grayson turned and walked out, leaving Karen sitting alone in her office, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but her resolve was strengthening. If Grayson thought he could intimidate her, he was mistaken. Karen picked up her phone and dialed Elijah's number. They needed to start the investigation immediately before things escalated further. By midday, Elijah and Karen were making their way through various locations around Westbridge, starting with interviews of residents who had expressed concerns about the police department. They sat in a small, cozy living room, speaking with Mrs. Beatrice Miller, an elderly woman who had lived in Westbridge her entire life. "I've seen things," Mrs. Miller began, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched a cup of tea. "Things that shouldn't be happening in this town. The way some of those officers treat young black men, it's like they think they can get away with anything." Karen nodded, her notepad open as she took notes. "Mrs. Miller, can you give us any specific examples? Anything that you've witnessed personally?" Mrs. Miller hesitated, glancing at Elijah. He gave her an encouraging smile, which seemed to give her the strength to continue. "There was a boy, Malcolm Jenkins. He was only 16. They stopped him right outside his own home. Said he looked suspicious. They roughed him up pretty badly, and when his parents tried to file a complaint, it just disappeared." Elijah's expression darkened. "And nothing ever came of it?" Mrs. Miller shook her head. "No. Malcolm's family moved away not long after that. Said they couldn't stay in a town where they felt unsafe." Karen exchanged a glance with Elijah. It was a pattern they were beginning to recognize, a pattern of intimidation and silence. They thanked Mrs. Miller for her time and assured her that they were going to do everything in their power to make things right. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, Karen turned to Elijah. "This is bigger than just what happened to you. There's a history here that's been swept under the rug for too long." Elijah nodded, his jaw set with determination. "And it's time to bring it all to light." Later that afternoon, Elijah found himself standing in front of his childhood home. It was a modest two-story house on a quiet street, the kind of place where the neighbors knew each other's names and kids played in the yard without worry. But today, the house felt heavy with memories. He had come to visit his mother, a strong woman who had raised him to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of home, freshly baked bread and lavender, greeted him, bringing a sense of comfort. "Elijah," his mother called from the kitchen. "I wasn't expecting you today." Elijah smiled as he entered the kitchen, where his mother, Grace Bennett, was busy preparing dinner. She looked up from the counter, her eyes softening as she saw him. "What's on your mind, son?" Elijah hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his worries. But he knew he couldn't keep this from her. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Dad." Grace's hand stilled, and she turned to face him fully. "Your father? Elijah, what's brought this on?" Elijah took a deep breath, then explained the investigation he had launched and how it had led him to confront some painful truths about the town they called home. Grace listened quietly, her expression unreadable, until Elijah mentioned the name Samuel Grayson. At that, her face paled, and she sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly. Grayson, I never thought I'd hear that name again. Elijah's heart tightened in his chest. Mom, what is it? What aren't you telling me? Grace looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. Elijah, there's something I never told you about your father's death. He didn't just pass away from a heart attack like I told you. He was beaten by the police. Elijah felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. What? Why didn't you tell me? I was scared, Grace admitted, her voice breaking. Scared for you. Scared for our family. Your father was a proud man, Elijah. He stood up for what was right, and it cost him his life. But I didn't want you to carry that burden. I didn't want you to grow up with that kind of anger in your heart. Elijah sank into a chair opposite her, his mind racing. Grayson, was he involved? Grace nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, his father was one of the officers who did it. They covered it up, made it look like a medical emergency. I wanted to fight it, but I was just one woman, and they were the law. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer, igniting a fire within him. This wasn't just about justice for himself. This was about justice for his father, for his family, and for all those who had suffered in silence. Mom, Elijah said, his voice filled with a new resolve. I'm going to make this right. I'm going to expose what they did, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again. Grace reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I believe in you, Elijah. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become. Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. This investigation was no longer just a matter of duty. It was personal. As evening fell, Elijah returned to Westbridge Town Hall, where a small group of supporters had gathered in his office. Karen was there, along with Reverend Johnson and a few trusted allies from the community. The mood was serious, but there was a shared determination in the room. Thank you all for being here, Elijah began, addressing the group. We've made some progress today, but it's clear that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a deep rot in this town that goes back decades, and we need to bring it all to the surface. Reverend Johnson nodded, his expression grave. Elijah, you have our full support, but you need to be prepared for the backlash. The people who benefit from the status quo won't let it go without a fight. Karen, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. I've already seen signs of it. Some of the officers are starting to push back, spreading rumors trying to discredit us. We need to be careful. This could get ugly fast. Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. I expected this, but it doesn't make it any easier. We need to stay focused, stay united. If we let them divide us, they win. The room fell silent as everyone considered the gravity of the situation. Finally, Reverend Johnson spoke again. Elijah, you've always been a man of integrity, and that's why people follow you. But don't forget that this fight isn't just yours to bear. We're all in this together. Elijah nodded, grateful for the support. I know, and I promise you, I won't back down. We're going to see this through, no matter what it takes. Later that night, as the town of Westbridge settled into the quiet of evening, St. John's Church was filled with a warm, inviting light. The pews were packed with community members who had come together in a show of solidarity for Elijah and the investigation he had launched. Reverend Johnson stood at the pulpit, his voice resonating through the sanctuary. We gather here tonight not just to support our mayor, Elijah Bennett, but to stand up for what is right. Our town has been burdened by the sins of the past for too long. It is time for us to lift that burden and move forward into a future where justice is not just a word, but a reality. The congregation responded with murmurs of agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and determination. Elijah, seated in the front row, felt a swell of emotion as he looked around at the faces of his friends, neighbors, and allies. Despite the challenges ahead, this gathering was a reminder that he was not alone in this fight. The community was behind him, and together they could bring about the change that Westbridge so desperately needed. Reverend Johnson continued, his words a beacon of hope in the darkness. Let us leave here tonight with a renewed sense of purpose. Let us carry the light of truth into the shadows of our town, and let us not rest until those shadows are banished forever. The congregation rose to their feet, a chorus of amens filling the church as they joined hands in a moment of unity. As Elijah left the church that night, he felt a renewed strength coursing through him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but he was ready. With the support of his community and the fire of justice burning in his heart, Elijah knew that they would overcome whatever lay ahead. Together, they would dig deeper, uncover the truth, and bring justice to Westbridge, no matter the cost. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Westbridge Library, casting a warm glow over the rows of bookshelves. Elijah Bennett and Detective Karen Whitaker sat at a large wooden table, surrounded by stacks of old files and faded records. The air was thick with dust, and the quiet of the library was only broken by the occasional rustle of paper. Karen carefully opened a yellowed file, her eyes scanning the contents with a focused intensity. "This is it, Elijah," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of triumph and dread. "I found the records on your father's case." Elijah leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What does it say?" Karen pulled out a series of documents, laying them out on the table. "It's all here: the police report, witness statements, even the medical examiner's notes. But there's more. Look at this." She handed Elijah a piece of paper, the ink faded but still legible. Elijah's eyes widened as he read the document. It was an internal memo, written by one of the officers involved in the case. The memo detailed a plan to cover up the true cause of his father's injuries, blaming them on a medical emergency rather than the brutal beating he had endured at the hands of the police. But what struck Elijah the most was the signature at the bottom of the memo: Officer Samuel Grayson, Sr. Elijah's hands trembled as he set the paper down. Grayson's father was involved in this. He was the one who led the cover-up. Karen nodded solemnly. "It's all here, Elijah. This is the evidence we need to expose the truth." Elijah's mind raced, a storm of emotions swirling within him. Anger, betrayal, sorrow. They all fought for dominance. "This changes everything, Karen. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about what they did to my father, to my family. I have to confront Grayson." Karen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I'm with you, Elijah. But you need to be careful. This information is explosive, and we don't know how Grayson will react." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know, but he needs to know the truth." The midday sun was high in the sky as Elijah walked into the Westbridge police precinct, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. He had asked Karen to wait outside. This was something he needed to do alone. The precinct was bustling with activity, but as soon as Elijah entered, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Officers who had been chatting with each other fell silent, their eyes following Elijah as he made his way through the building. He ignored the stares, his focus solely on the man he was about to confront. Elijah found Samuel Grayson in his office, hunched over a stack of paperwork. The officer looked up as Elijah entered, his expression hardening. "Bennett," Grayson greeted coldly. "What do you want?" Elijah closed the door behind him, his eyes locking onto Grayson's. "We need to talk, Grayson, about our fathers." Grayson's brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" Elijah stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "I know what your father did. I know he was involved in the cover-up of my father's death. And I know you've been following in his footsteps, whether you realize it or not." Grayson's face paled, and for a moment, Elijah saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or doubt, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. My father was a good man, and so am I. We enforce the law, keep order in this town. If your father got caught up in something, that's on him." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "My father was beaten to death by your father and his colleagues because he stood up for what was right. And now, you're doing the same thing, using your badge to justify your own prejudices." Grayson stood up, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you could just walk in here and accuse me of that? You don't know anything about me or my father." You're just trying to stir up trouble. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice steady. I'm not here to stir up trouble, Grayson. I'm here to make things right. I don't want to see this town torn apart by the same hatred that destroyed my father. But you need to face the truth. Your father wasn't a hero. He was a coward who hid behind his badge to commit terrible acts. And you're on the same path. Grayson's hands trembled slightly, but he remained defiant. Get out, Bennett. Get out of my office before I have you thrown out. Elijah nodded, knowing that this confrontation wouldn't end here. You're going to have to face this sooner or later, Grayson. The truth is out there, and it's not going away. With that, Elijah turned and walked out of the office, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. He knew this was just the beginning, and the fight ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared for whatever came next. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows as Elijah returned to his office at the Westbridge Town Hall. His encounter with Grayson had left him shaken, but not deterred. He knew the path he had chosen would be fraught with obstacles, but he couldn't turn back now. As he entered his office, he was greeted by Carla, who looked up from her desk with a concerned expression. Elijah, you've been getting calls all afternoon. Some people are starting to get nervous about the investigation, and I'm hearing whispers that a few key witnesses are refusing to testify. They're scared, Elijah. Elijah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I expected this. The deeper we dig, the more resistance we're going to face. But we can't let that stop us. Carla handed him a stack of papers. Reverend Johnson called. He wants to meet with you and Karen to discuss a plan to keep the investigation alive, despite the pushback. Elijah nodded, taking the papers. Set up the meeting. We need to figure out how to keep our momentum going. We can't afford to lose any more ground. Carla gave him a reassuring smile. You're doing the right thing, Elijah. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Elijah smiled back, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Thanks, Carla. I just hope it's enough. Later that afternoon, Elijah, Karen, and Reverend Johnson gathered in Elijah's office, the atmosphere tense but determined. Reverend Johnson was the first to speak, his voice steady and calm. We're facing a lot of opposition, Elijah, but we've always known this wouldn't be easy. The question now is, how do we keep the investigation moving forward without losing the support of the community? Karen leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. We need to reassure the community that we're not backing down, but we also need to be smart about how we proceed. We can't afford any more setbacks. Elijah nodded, his mind racing as he considered their options. We need to find a way to protect the witnesses, to give them the confidence they need to testify. Maybe we can work with the state or federal authorities to provide some kind of protection. Reverend Johnson nodded thoughtfully. That's a good idea, Elijah. We also need to keep the community engaged. If people see that we're making progress, they'll be more likely to stand with us, even in the face of intimidation. Karen looked at Elijah, her eyes filled with determination. We're in this together, Elijah. Whatever it takes, we'll see this through. Elijah felt a surge of gratitude for the people standing by his side. Thank you, both of you. I don't know what I'd do without your support. Let's make sure we don't let them down. That evening, Samuel Grayson sat alone in his living room, the dim light of the television casting flickering shadows across the walls. But he wasn't paying attention to the news broadcast on the screen. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, and he couldn't shake the conversation he had had with Elijah earlier that day. Grayson had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who upheld the law and maintained order. But Elijah's words had cut deep, striking at the core of everything Grayson believed about himself and his father. Could it be true? Could his father, the man he had idolized his entire life, have been capable of such brutality? Grayson poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared at it. He took a long sip, hoping it would numb the gnawing doubt that had taken root in his mind. But it didn't help. He could still see Elijah's face, hear his voice, calm and unyielding as he spoke the truth Grayson had tried so hard to deny. Grayson's hand tightened around the glass, his knuckles turning white. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. But the evidence was there, in those old records, in the memories that had begun to resurface in the back of his mind. For the first time in his life, Grayson felt truly lost. The foundation of his beliefs had been shaken, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. As he sat there in the dark, Grayson knew he had a choice to make. He could continue down the path he had always walked, clinging to the ideals that had been instilled in him from a young age. Or he could face the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and try to make things right. But which path would he choose? Late that evening, the Westbridge Police Precinct was quieter than usual, the night shift officers working diligently to finish their tasks. Karen Whitaker sat at her desk, reviewing the day's reports, when there was a soft knock on her door. She looked up to see Officer Davis, a young officer who had been on the force for only a few years. His face was pale, and he looked nervous as he stepped into the room. "Detective Whitaker," Davis began hesitantly, I need to talk to you about something." Karen set down her pen and gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Davis?" Davis sat down, fidgeting with his hands. "I've been hearing things about the investigation you and Mayor Bennett are working on. And, well, I found something that I think you should see." Karen's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "What did you find?" Davis glanced around the room, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, handing it to Karen. "I found this in one of the old evidence lockers. It's from years ago, before I even joined the force. I don't know why it was hidden away, but I think it's important." Karen took the flash drive, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, Davis. You did the right thing by bringing this to me." Davis nodded, looking relieved. I want to do what's right, even if it means going against some of the older guys. I don't want to be a part of something that's wrong." Karen gave him a reassuring smile. "You're a good officer, Davis, and you're doing the right thing. I'll take it from here." As Davis left the room, Karen plugged the flash drive into her computer, her heart pounding with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of video files, all dated around the time of Elijah's father's death. Karen's eyes widened as she clicked on the first file, the grainy footage revealing what appeared to be a secret meeting between several officers, including Samuel Grayson, Sr., discussing the cover-up of the incident. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But as the reality of what she had uncovered sank in, Karen knew that they were in more danger than ever. This evidence was powerful, but it also made them targets. Karen took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. They would have to move carefully, but this evidence could finally expose the truth. She picked up her phone and dialed Elijah's number. It was time to take the next step in their fight for justice. The morning air was crisp as Elijah Bennett arrived at Westbridge Town Hall. The building was already surrounded by a crowd, with people holding signs and banners, some in support of Elijah's investigation, others condemning it. The town had become a powder keg, with tensions mounting as the investigation gained momentum. Elijah pushed through the throng, the murmurs of the crowd a mix of encouragement and dissent. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, each person waiting to see what he would do next. As he entered the town hall, Carla was there to greet him, her expression troubled. "Elijah," she began, "things are getting out of hand out there. We've got protests scheduled for the rest of the week, both for and against the investigation. People are scared, and they're starting to take sides." Elijah nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I know, Carla, but we can't back down now. This is too important." Carla handed him a stack of papers. "We need to be careful, Elijah. The more divided the town becomes, the harder it will be to get the truth out. We need to keep the focus on justice, not on the conflict." Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but how do we do that when everyone's emotions are running so high?" Carla looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "We take it one step at a time. Let's get through this day and see where we stand. The town hall meeting is about to start, and we need to be ready." Elijah nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." As they entered the meeting room, Elijah was met with the sight of a packed house. The tension was palpable, with groups of people clustered together, whispering and watching each other warily. Elijah took his place at the front of the room, flanked by Karen Whitaker and Reverend Johnson. "Thank you all for coming," Elijah began, his voice steady despite the pressure he felt. "I know that many of you have concerns about the investigation, and I'm here to address them. But first, let me make one thing clear. This investigation is about finding the truth and ensuring that justice is served. It's not about dividing our community, but about healing it. A murmur ran through the crowd, and a man stood up in the back of the room. Mayor Bennett, how can you say that when this investigation is tearing our town apart? People are scared and they're angry. Some of us believe in what you're doing, but others think you're just stirring up trouble. Elijah met the man's gaze, his expression resolute. I understand your concerns, but let me ask you this. Is it better to ignore the truth and let injustice continue, or to confront it head-on, even if it's difficult? We can't build a better future for Westbridge if we don't address the issues that have been plaguing us for years. Another voice called out from the side of the room, a woman's voice filled with frustration. But what about the good officers on the force? Are they going to be dragged through the mud because of a few bad apples? Karen stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. This investigation isn't about condemning the entire police force. It's about holding those accountable who have abused their power. The good officers, those who truly want to serve and protect, should welcome this because it will help restore trust between the police and the community. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Elijah took the opportunity to address the crowd once more. I'm asking you all to stand with us, not against each other. This is our town, our community. If we want to see real change, we have to work together. The tension in the room eased slightly, and after a few more questions, the meeting ended. But as Elijah left the town hall, he knew that the battle was far from over. The town was on edge, and it would take more than words to bridge the growing divide. The midday sun filtered through the windows of Samuel Grayson's home, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over him. He sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Elijah's words from their confrontation still echoed in his mind, gnawing at the carefully constructed image of his father that Grayson had held onto for so long. Could it be true? Had his father, the man he had idolized, been involved in something so horrific? Grayson took another sip of his drink, the alcohol burning a path down his throat, but it did little to numb the pain. He stared at the photograph on the wall, a picture of his father in his police uniform, standing tall and proud. But now, that pride felt like a lie. The more Grayson thought about it, the more the doubts crept in. He had always followed the rules, done what he thought was right, but now he wasn't so sure. Had he been blindly upholding a legacy of violence and prejudice? The sound of the front door opening snapped Grayson out of his thoughts. His wife, Emily, walked in, her expression concerned as she saw the state he was in. Sam, she said softly, coming to sit beside him. What's going on? You've been distant ever since the investigation started. Talk to me. Grayson stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes. It's about my father. About what Elijah said. I've been trying to convince myself that he's wrong, that my father wasn't capable of those things. But I'm starting to wonder if I've been lying to myself all these years. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. Sam, whatever the truth is, you need to face it. Running from it won't help. If your father did those things, it doesn't mean you have to follow in his footsteps. Grayson finally looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. But what if I already have? What if I'm no better than he was? Emily shook her head, her voice resolute. You're not your father, Sam. You have the power to make your own choices, to do what's right. But you have to be honest with yourself first. Grayson felt a lump form in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He knew she was right, but the path forward was terrifying. Admitting the truth meant confronting everything he had believed in, everything he had built his life around. But as he looked into Emily's eyes, he knew he couldn't keep running. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The afternoon sun was high in the sky as Karen Whitaker entered the Westbridge Police Precinct, her mind focused on the next steps in the investigation. She had the flash drive Davis had given her, the evidence that could finally expose the corruption within the department. But as she walked down the hallway, she noticed something was off. Officers were whispering to each other, their eyes following her with a mix of suspicion and hostility. Karen's heart sank. Something was wrong. She reached her office and found the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she froze. Her desk was in disarray, papers scattered everywhere, and the flash drive she had left locked in her drawer was gone. Karen's stomach twisted with dread. This was no ordinary break-in. Someone had targeted her. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Detective Whitaker," a voice called from the doorway. Karen turned to see Captain Hargrove, his expression stern. "Captain," Karen greeted, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've just had a break-in. The evidence I was working on, it's gone." Hargrove's face hardened. "I'm aware. There's something else, Karen. I've just been informed that you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Karen's heart dropped. "On what grounds?" "Pending an internal investigation," Hargrove replied, his tone flat. "It seems there have been some concerns raised about your conduct during this investigation." Karen felt a surge of anger and frustration. She knew exactly what this was, an attempt to silence her, to derail the investigation. "This is retaliation, Captain. You know that." Hargrove sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Karen, you're a good detective, but you're treading on dangerous ground here. My hands are tied. For now, I suggest you take some time off and let this blow over." Karen clenched her fists, but she knew there was nothing she could do in that moment. "Fine, but this isn't over, Captain. Not by a long shot." As she left the precinct, Karen's mind raced. The flash drive was gone, and she was off the case, but she wasn't about to give up. She had come too far to back down now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town of Westbridge in a warm, golden glow, Elijah Bennett sat alone in his living room, his thoughts heavy with doubt. The events of the day had shaken him to his core. The protests, the division in the community, the setbacks in the investigation. It was all becoming too much to bear. He had always believed in the power of truth and justice, but now, for the first time, he wondered if it was enough. The forces arrayed against him were powerful, and the cost of this fight was becoming increasingly clear. Grace entered the room, her expression filled with concern as she saw the look on her husband's face. "Elijah, what's wrong? You've been distant all evening." Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can do this, Grace. The investigation, the town, it's all falling apart. People are getting hurt, and I'm not sure if it's worth it." Grace sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Elijah, you've always been a fighter. You've always stood up for what's right, no matter the cost. Don't let doubt stop you now." Elijah looked into her eyes, seeing the love and support there, but also the worry. "But what if I'm making things worse? What if this fight destroys everything we've worked for?" Grace squeezed his hand, her voice filled with quiet strength. "This fight isn't just about you, Elijah. It's about our community, our future. You've already inspired so many people to stand up and demand change. Don't let them down now." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm scared, Grace. Scared of what might happen if I keep going. Scared of what might happen if I don't." Grace leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "It's okay to be scared, Elijah. But don't let fear stop you from doing what's right. You've come this far, don't give up now." Elijah nodded, the warmth of her words giving him the strength he needed. He wasn't alone in this fight, and as long as he had people like Grace by his side, he knew he could keep going. Later that night, the air inside St. John's Church was thick with anticipation. The pews were filled with members of the community, their faces a mix of worry and determination. At the front of the room, Reverend Johnson stood tall, his voice carrying over the congregation as he spoke. "We gather here tonight to reaffirm our commitment to the truth, to justice, and to each other," Reverend Johnson began, his tone resolute. "The road ahead is difficult, but we must not lose sight of our goal. Elijah Bennett has been fighting for us, for our town, and now it's our turn to stand with him." Elijah stood beside the Reverend, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked out at the faces of the people he had dedicated his life to serving. Despite the setbacks, despite the challenges, they had not lost faith in him. Reverend Johnson turned to Elijah, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah, you have led us with integrity and courage. You have inspired us to demand the justice we deserve. Tonight, we stand with you, united in our resolve to see this fight through to the end." The congregation erupted in applause, their support washing over Elijah like a wave. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, the doubts and fears that had plagued him earlier that day fading away. As the applause died down, Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you. Thank you all for your support, for your belief in this cause. I know the road ahead is uncertain, and I know we will face more challenges. But together, we can overcome them. Together, we can bring about the change Westbridge so desperately needs." The congregation rose to their feet, their voices joining together in a powerful chorus of unity and determination. As Elijah looked out at the sea of faces, he knew that he had found the strength to continue. He would not back down, and neither would the people of Westbridge. That night, as Elijah left the church, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. The fight was far from over, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead. With the support of his community and the love of his family, Elijah knew that they could, and would, see this through to the end. The early morning light streamed through the curtains of Samuel Grayson's home, casting a soft glow over the living room. Grayson sat on the edge of his couch, his head in his hands, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The truth he had been running from his entire life was now staring him in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. He couldn't live with the guilt any longer. The legacy of violence and prejudice that his father had passed down to him was not something he wanted to carry any further. Grayson knew what he had to do, but the thought of it terrified him. Taking a deep breath, Grayson reached for his phone and dialed Karen Whitaker's number. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Detective Whitaker," Karen's voice came through, steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Karen, it's Sam," Grayson said, his voice cracking slightly. There was a pause on the other end before Karen responded, her tone cautious. "Sam, what's going on?" "I need to talk to you," Grayson said, his words coming out in a rush. "I can't keep this inside anymore. I need to confess." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She had been hoping Grayson would come to this decision, but now that the moment was here, she felt a surge of anxiety. "Are you sure, Sam? Once you do this, there's no going back." Grayson closed his eyes, steeling himself. "I'm sure. I can't live with this lie anymore. I'll testify. I'll give you everything you need. Just please help me do the right thing." Karen's voice softened, filled with a mix of relief and compassion. "Okay, Sam. I'll come by your place in an hour. We'll do this together." As Grayson hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making the right choice, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built his life around. By midday, the Westbridge Town Hall was filled to capacity. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the townspeople crowded into the large meeting room. They were here for a public hearing that would either confirm or shatter their trust in the very institutions that had governed their lives for generations. Elijah Bennett stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared to speak. Beside him, Karen Whitaker stood tall, her presence a steadying force. And just behind them, Samuel Grayson sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. The room fell silent as Elijah stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice was clear and resolute, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that betrayed the weight of the moment. "Thank you all for coming," Elijah began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people he had dedicated his life to serving. "Today, we are here to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The events of the past few weeks have exposed deep-seated issues within our community, issues that can no longer be ignored." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Officer Samuel Grayson has something he needs to say, something that will change the course of this town's history." Grayson stood up, his legs trembling slightly as he walked to the podium. The room was so quiet that the sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls. He looked out at the sea of faces, his own expression a mix of fear and determination. "I know that many of you don't trust me right now," Grayson began, his voice hoarse. "And I don't blame you. But I'm here today to tell the truth, a truth I've been running from for far too long." He swallowed hard, his eyes locking onto Elijah's for a brief moment before he continued. My father. My father was one of the officers involved in the beating of Elijah Bennett's father during the civil rights era. And I've spent my entire life trying to live up to his legacy, not knowing that legacy was built on a lie. There was a collective gasp from the crowd, and the room erupted into murmurs of shock and disbelief. Grayson took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, because I believed in a version of justice that was tainted by prejudice. But I can't continue down that path anymore. I'm here to confess my wrongdoing and to provide the evidence that will finally expose the truth about what happened to Elijah's father and about the corruption within our police department. As Grayson's words hung in the air, the room fell silent once more. The gravity of his confession was sinking in, the truth settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Elijah watched Grayson with a mixture of sadness and relief. The man who had once been his adversary was now his ally, standing beside him in the fight for justice. Karen stepped forward, placing a hand on Grayson's shoulder as she addressed the crowd. What you've just heard is only the beginning. There is much work to be done, but today we take the first step toward healing and rebuilding our community. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of emotion sweeping through the room as the townspeople began to realize the significance of what had just happened. The truth had finally been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The hours following the public hearing were a whirlwind of activity. The news of Samuel Grayson's confession spread like wildfire, and by the afternoon, the Westbridge Police Precinct was under intense scrutiny. Reporters swarmed the building, demanding answers as the community grappled with the implications of the day's events. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. The police chief had resigned in the wake of the scandal, and several officers were placed under investigation. The once impenetrable walls of the department were beginning to crumble, and the sense of power and authority that had once been so pervasive was now giving way to uncertainty and fear. Karen Whitaker walked through the precinct, her steps purposeful as she made her way to her office. The look she received from her colleagues were a mix of respect and resentment, but she held her head high. She had done the right thing, and she wouldn't let anyone make her doubt that. As she entered her office, she found Elijah waiting for her. He looked tired, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Karen, Elijah greeted, his voice warm despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. Hey, Elijah, Karen replied, offering him a small smile. I heard the investigation is moving forward. Elijah nodded. Yeah, it is. The state's coming in to oversee it, and they've already started looking into the files Grayson provided. It's going to take time, but we're finally making progress. Karen leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. It's been a long road, but we're getting there. Elijah's expression softened as he looked at her. I couldn't have done this without you, Karen. You've been there every step of the way, even when things got tough. Karen shrugged, a modest smile playing on her lips. It was the right thing to do, Elijah, and I'm just glad we're starting to see some real change. Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. So am I. But I know this isn't the end. There's still so much work to be done. Karen's gaze met his, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. The road ahead was still long, but they had taken the first steps together, and that made all the difference. That evening, Elijah Bennett sat on the porch of his home, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the quiet street. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind, but there was also a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. As he sipped his tea, the sound of footsteps caught his attention. He looked up to see Samuel Grayson approaching, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. There was a tension in his posture, but also a determination that Elijah hadn't seen before. Grayson, Elijah greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. Bennett, Grayson replied, stopping a few feet away from the porch. Can we talk? Elijah nodded, gesturing for Grayson to join him. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had passed between them hanging in the air. I'm sorry, Grayson said finally, his voice low and filled with regret. For everything. Elijah looked at him, his expression thoughtful. I know you are, Grayson, and I appreciate you coming forward with the truth. But it's going to take time for the town to heal from all of this. For both of us to heal. Grayson nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. I know. I want to make things right if I can. Elijah studied him for a moment, then sighed. We're both victims of our father's legacies, Grayson. But that doesn't mean we have to repeat their mistakes. We can choose a different path. Grayson looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Do you really believe that? Elijah nodded, his voice firm. I do. But it's not going to be easy. Forgiveness and reconciliation are hard, but they're possible. We just have to be willing to put in the work. Grayson swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I want to try. Elijah offered him a small, but genuine smile. Then let's take it one step at a time. The two men sat in silence for a while longer, the tension between them gradually easing. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you needed. Later that evening, St. John's Church was once again filled with members of the Westbridge community. The mood was somber but hopeful, the congregation gathering to reflect on the events that had shaken their town to its core. Reverend Johnson stood at the pulpit, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. We have been through a great deal together, and we have seen the very foundations of our community shaken. But tonight, we gather not to mourn, but to look forward, to a future that we can build together. Elijah sat in the front row, listening to the Reverend's words with a sense of quiet resolve. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also brought about the kind of change he had always hoped to see in Westbridge. As Reverend Johnson continued to speak, he gestured for Elijah to join him at the pulpit. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then stood, feeling the eyes of the congregation on him as he made his way to the front. Mayor Bennett, Reverend Johnson said, his voice warm with pride, you have led us with courage and integrity. And now, I believe the people of Westbridge would like to hear from you. Elijah took a deep breath, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked out at the faces of the people he had fought so hard to serve. Thank you, Reverend, and thank you, all of you, for standing with me through this difficult time. He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. We've been through a lot together, and we've seen our town's darkest secrets brought to light. But out of that darkness, I believe we can find a way forward, a way to build a better, more just Westbridge for all of us. The congregation erupted into applause, their support a powerful reminder of the strength of the community. As Elijah looked out at the faces of his friends, neighbors, and allies, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had come a long way, and while there was still work to be done, they were on the right path. That night, as Elijah left the church and walked home, the cool night air filled with the sounds of the town he loved, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been worth it. Together, they had uncovered the truth, faced their past, and begun the process of healing. And as Elijah looked up at the stars shining brightly overhead, he knew that the future was full of promise. Westbridge was ready for a new beginning, and so was he.